Hi everyone, today we're going to do a crash course in JSON. Now JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a way to represent data in text files or just in data streams so that different systems can communicate with each other. Now this is really important in blockchain because as a blockchain programmer, the odds are you're not going to be writing a new protocol and you're not going to be writing even that many smart contracts, but what you will be doing a lot of is interfacing with external systems. You know, blockchain isn't that great on the user interface side, so most of the applications that people are going to use on a day-to-day basis are going to be these legacy systems, but they're going to need to interface with the blockchain. So JSON's been around since the mid-2000s. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And it's a lightweight way to transfer data back and forth between systems. A lot of times people come to me and they'll say, well, can you send me the data in a comma separated format, or can you send it to me in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet? Okay, those are really hard ways to work with data. You're going to see that JSON makes working with data very, very easy. So there's really three reasons you would use JSON. One is what we've been talking about, which is transferring data from one system to another system. The second thing is in configuration files. If you're using different databases, you might put in the secret key and your password will go in a JSON configuration file. So all a JSON configuration files is a text file with a JSON object in it that is the parameters for your configuration. And then the third thing is in document style databases. If you're familiar with MongoDB, you're familiar with document style databases, in a lot of cases the data is actually stored in the database in a JSON format. So this isn't something you're going to be able to get away from. You're going to need to know it. So I recommend tune in and let's go through this quickly, and you're going to find out that there's not a lot to it. But in the meantime, you're tuned into the Blockchain Education channel. Please hit subscribe. If you haven't subscribed yet, ring the bell for notifications, because each week I'm going to be bringing you new technologies, new parts of the blockchain, and we'll be talking about at least once every week. So in the common jargon, if I'm asking somebody or I'm asking somebody for some data, I'm usually going to ask for a JSON array or a JSON object. Now, if you don't remember anything from this course, remember that the square brackets are arrays and the curly braces are objects. Arrays and objects are the primary thing you do with JSON. So what is an array? An array is just a list of items of any data type that JSON supports. So in this case, we just have an array which is in square brackets with 5 elements in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in this case, the 5 elements are all numbers. Now, there's a limited number of data types that are represented in JSON, which is kind of good because it makes it easy to remember the things you need to know. So the primitive data types are numbers and strings. Now, when you represent a number, you can represent it in any format. It could just be the number 1, it could be 1.0, it can even be scientific notation. The JSON interpreter will figure it out if it's a number. The second primitive is strings. Strings are just strings are just data that are inside of double quotes. So a string is your second primitive. Now, a null value just means it's an empty value. A null, just like in a null value in a database, you have a null value in a JSON, in JSON. So now objects, which we'll get into a second, and then other arrays. So when you create an array, it's going to be a list of anything. So it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but then it could also be 1, 2, object, another array. So JSON is extremely flexible, and that's one of the things that makes it so powerful. So let's look at another array. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and null. In this case, 1 is a string, 2 is a string spelled out, 3 is a number, 4 is a number, and then 5 is a null value. Null value basically says that there is a 5th element in this array, but it doesn't actually have a value. So when you think about records, now if you're used to relational database, you think about records. So let's say I have an employee record. Well, a record has fields. That's what an object is. An object is it's a list of key value pairs. Now in this case, I have a record, and it's Ed with a score of 40 in the city of Chicago. So each of the keys, so the name, which would be the field name, colon, and then ed, which is the value of the field, then comma, then score, colon, 40. As you see by the way this is represented, it's represented pretty simply. You've got your key value pairs where the keys are both the keys are in double quotes. If it's a string, the value's in double quotes. If it's a number, it's just represented as a number. Okay, so this is your object representation. Now, an array of objects is really what you would think of in a relational database as a record set. So if I was doing something like select name, score, city from a table, it would return multiple records. Those multiple records are the objects, and then they're in a list. So as you can see from this on the screen, we have our entire array, starts with a square bracket and ends with a square bracket, but then inside of it, we have objects that are separated by commas. So the one really, really powerful thing that objects have is the ability to be nested. And this is kind of where document style databases come from. In a relational database, I might have two tables. I might have person, which would have like name, score, and then address. And then I would have another table, which is address, where you see street, city, and zip. You see by this representation, the third element of the object is an address object. So what we're doing here is we're nesting an object inside of another object. This is really where JSON gets powerful, because you can take all the data that you need to send related to something, and you can format it in a really nice nested format in ways that you'll find when you start working with JSON that this is where the power of JSON comes in. So that leads to document databases. Now, a document is really a JSON object. So each document is an object. Now, some of the document style databases extend JSON by adding data types. I believe it's MongoDB has something called BSON, which is got a few extra data types added to it. But document databases are a great way to store data that's shared on the blockchain. So if I've got an object, I want to share it on the blockchain, but I don't actually want to put it on the blockchain, putting it in a document, putting it in a JSON object, which is stored as a document style database, is a great way to store data that you're using in blockchain. So two things that you're going to need to do when you're working with JSON is you're going to need to be able to import JSON when somebody sends you JSON and export JSON when somebody asks you for JSON. So in both cases, it's usually done with one or two lines of code. So I have a piece of code up here on the screen, which is a very simple piece of PHP code. So if somebody wants to send me a piece of JSON string and I want to turn it into an associative array in PHP, I can do that with one line of code. In this case, it's the JSON decode function. Again, it's just one line of code. Almost every language handles JSON in one or two lines of code. Now, if I want to export JSON, here's a case where what I'd be using is I'd be using database objects in PHP. Let's say I selected all the records of a table. I could actually select and run an entire SQL query and then just take the result and execute it as with a JSON encode function to export it. So JSON is one of those things that is really pretty easy to learn. Again, in a very, very short time, I've covered almost everything you need to know about JSON. Just remember, square brackets are arrays, curly braces are objects. You can nest them. Simple. They work with simple data types, and there's something that you're going to use a lot. So it's something that if you're not used to it, if you're used to transferring data in comma separated values or XML, something I highly recommend that you start working with and getting used to. But again, it's something that you're going to need to know for blockchain. And I'll see you next time.